What do you think?
This is our California Humanities Council panel of community and academic scholars. And they've been working with us on a project since we started. In fact, Marcia Osis is one of the people who really thought of the idea of doing this project, interviewing vets, that we would turn into dramatic narrative. The rest of the panel is Ron Barrett, professor of psychology, Marcia Osis, who's a member of Compassion in Action, Twilight Brigade, hospice services for vets at the VA hospital in Westwood, and Larry Treidel, who's professor of history at Loyola Marymount, and is also a combat veteran. And I'd like to ask Larry to start. What we're going to just talk about is, well, just tonight, like, what are the important things that stood out to you when you were listening to these stories?
Well, I teach Greek and Roman history. At least that's what I started out. I came back from Vietnam in early 1971. I went to school. And Vietnam was about the last thing I wanted to think about. And didn't think about it. And actually, you heard tonight my wife's comments about living with the veteran and the silence of the veteran and that sort of thing. And that changed for me in about 15 years ago, reading a book called Achilles in Vietnam, which the rather odd-sounding title perhaps brought together the experience of combat veterans from Homer's time, the Iliad, the Odyssey, with those of Vietnam. And as odd-sounding as it is, it actually does work pretty well. And so about the last 15 years at Loyola Marymount, I've been teaching courses dealing with war, with violence, pulling together classical antiquity along with Vietnam, World War II, virtually all the wars. And I think one of the things you heard tonight is the commonality of the experience. It doesn't make any difference if it was 2,500 years ago or if it was last week. The reality of war, the reality of combat, what violence does to you, what it does to the human condition is virtually the same. And this can be validated again and again and again, and across the ages, across culture as well. So in a sense, what you heard was not just a snapshot of American experiences since World War II, but really a snapshot that stands for all time, and I think for all people. So it's really a very, very real experience in all kinds of ways.
And Marcia, what stood out to you? You've heard it now 4 times.
I've heard it now.
Has it changed for you over that time, or something new tonight, or what's?
Well, I've been listening to vet stories. I've been serving as a hospice volunteer at the West LA VA for about 10 years now. And mostly what I do there is I listen to the stories. This is the first Veterans Day in 11 years that I haven't spent at the VA. And I have to tell you that I always come away from the VA every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day. I come away in tears. I'm grieving because the halls are empty. Especially on Memorial Day, the combat vets are grieving. And there's nobody to receive the stories. And I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a room. On the holidays, I try to see not just my hospice guys, but as many people as I can. And I just walk in to say, it's Memorial Day, it's Veterans Day. I honor you. Thank you for your service. Welcome home, sometimes I'll say, if it's a guy about my age, a Vietnam vet. And sometimes they just cry because still they haven't heard that enough times. And this is the biggest VA in the entire country. And it's like a soft right turn off of Wilshire Boulevard in the middle of the biggest city. And there's nobody there. And Mike Baldridge, when he was a patient at the West LA VA, he was one of my guys. I was his volunteer. He was in hospice and he didn't die. We don't have an agenda about that, so we were very happy that he lived and he became a volunteer. But I have to tell you that in the year and a half I visited him, the stories he told me there were very different stories than the stories he shared with us for this project. And I talked to another writer tonight who said it wasn't until the third interview that I got the real story. First, they tell you their prepared story, the story that they want you to hear, the story that will entertain you, the story about the rest and recreation and losing their virginity and the fun stuff. And when I asked Mike to do this project, we got the real story. And I want to thank the vets who participated in this for the courage it took to tell the real stories. And the audience who came here today to be the listeners, because if there's no listener, it doesn't close the circle, it doesn't make a connection, it doesn't create community. I have so much to say, and I mostly want to hear from you, but if anybody has ever taken my hospice training, you've heard me quote from Rachel Naomi Remen, who's a hero of mine, who said, listening is the oldest and perhaps the most profound tool of healing. It's often the quality of our listening and not the wisdom of our words that makes the most profound difference in the people around us. When we listen, we offer with our attention an opportunity for wholeness. So I want to thank the people in this audience who came here today to be the listeners, because this circle can't be closed without the listeners. The stories need to be heard because they're not just the vet stories, they're our stories too. And they need to be heard and they need to be cared about. And the vets need to know that we care about their stories. So I've heard the stories a million times. I've read the script 1,000 times. I know it by heart. I wrote one piece of it, and still when I see it performed, it touches me, it makes me weep, and it changes something in me. And Larry, take it away.
Ron, has it changed?
Ron, I'm sorry,
Has it
you
changed
changed
for
your
you?
name. I changed Ron's name to Larry.
That's okay.
What you get from it, has it been different nights, or how do you feel finally having seen it these 4 times?
Every time I get something different. I think like watching a movie, you see something that you didn't see the first time. So, but it's still a very powerful piece, and I certainly agree with everything that's been said. The thing that was fascinating for me in terms of listening to the stories and hearing the narrative make reference to the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. The thing that's important to note is that the term, we didn't have a language, we didn't have a term for post-traumatic stress disorder until Charles Figley and some of his colleagues coined that term after Vietnam. The vets who came back showed a cluster of symptoms that were fairly consistent, and it included the numbing, the emotional distancing, the flashbacks, the overwhelming anxiety, and just difficulty in terms of reconciling the horrors of what they'd experienced. And the term PTSD surfaced in the literature. I know last night someone asked the question, does it seem to be on the rise? I don't think so. From my perspective, I don't think it's on the rise. I think that because we have a new focus and we have a new concept, we're more aware of it and we see it more. So like anything else, once you attend to it and you perceptually focus on something, you tend to see it more. So I'm not so sure if it's on the rise, but certainly it is a common element, as Larry was saying, in terms of the horrors of what war does, particularly to the psychic of very impressionable, you know, young men and women who are often sent into harm's way. And I think it's also true to acknowledge that in terms of our medical science and our clinical practice, we are much better at healing the physical body than we are with healing the mind. We still have miles and miles to go in terms of really being able to understand what we can do in terms of helping to treat and help vets to deal with PTSD and some of the experiences of grief and loss that you saw in the narrative. So in terms of psychiatry and mental health, there's a lot of work to be done, and we have much more to go. And I think the Office of Veterans Administration is much more organized. They're organizing more services now than before. But certainly, in a lot of the stories, and if you talk to vets, you hear lots of accounts of people being underserved, and I think we can do better in that regard.
I just heard on the news today that the mayor's office of Los Angeles has opened an office for legal aid, to provide free legal aid to veterans who are having trouble getting care for PTSD. And one of the things we found out, and certainly we hear a lot in the stories, is what a hard time they're having with the VA, getting the VA to pay attention. So maybe this office will help, I don't know. It sounded good to me. For people in the audience, we'd like to hear what your reactions are to the stories that were told tonight, whether you're civilians or veterans. What stood out to you? What came across as important to you from what you heard tonight? Yes.
Vietnam combat veteran. Two things stood out.
Yeah.
That, you know, my family tradition goes to World War I, World War II, and myself in Vietnam, and like that. And the spread, and you mentioned, sir, of the Achilles in Vietnam. I had a chance to look at that book some time ago. The whole perspective of combat veterans sharing this kind of unique set of experiences that allows us, not only as different generations of warriors, to relate to each other easily, but also people we fought against. There are numerous wonderful stories of soldiers from the Pacific meeting Japanese warriors and Germans, and going back to Vietnam, these things, commonalities that bring you together, and you can deal with common problems, express healing in fashions in that respect that are profoundly moving, and gives me a great deal of hope for the sanity of our species on the one hand, in an odd kind of way. The thing that's left out of the story all the time and seems to personally drive me a little cuckoo is the fact that we are doing this as a part of cultures, of societies. And we look to encapsulate what's happened to folks in terms of battle fatigue, soldier's heart, PTSD, and so on, and don't look at the larger picture of it, that some group of people decided we're going to war. Those people never went to the damn war. They've got all the money, they make all the decisions, they never show up, they don't bleed. And it keeps going on that way. From Vietnam, I'm so outraged by this right now because Iraq, Afghanistan, and all this, the same kind of mistakes, the same people that are never there, that are dragging all the money into their pocketbooks, and the same kind of issues that don't get brought into the clinical treatment of the veteran. It seems to me we're losing a piece of it when the veterans are not allowed to get their own heads around the fact that they've been betrayed and used. World War II was a very different story to my way of thinking. A lot of our misadventures militarily have been, I think, radically different than that. And that level of looking at the wounds and the grief that go on, I don't think can be resolved until you start taking into account the fact that there is a lot of misuses of power in this and other countries throughout history. It's nothing new. And that doesn't get encapsulated in how we deal with the veterans. it doesn't bring them, I think, up to a level of responsible citizenship where we can see, yes, we have our wounds, we need to deal with our emotional stuff, our problems, get our feet on the ground, and also educate each other, and struggle sometimes because there's no real agreement on some of these issues. But it's not, in my mind, coming to the front nearly enough so that we are addressing this not just as how do we heal the veterans, but how do we take a look at the parts of our society that are continuing to create veterans.
Part of our whole goal with this process, you say that the veterans are relationships. When I go around to the nursing homes, I see the Vietnam veterans hanging out together, and the World War II veterans thinking that Vietnam veterans are bruises because they're whining about their PTSD, and the World War II guys sucked it up and we didn't complain. And so part of this was to open a dialogue to show that if you were in combat, the experience was the same. The culture of the war was different, and the culture of the society was different. But if you're laying in a foxhole, or in the jungle, or in the forest, or in the desert, and somebody's shooting at you and trying to kill you, the feeling is the same. Terror is the same wherever it is. And then closing the circle the other way is we cannot make the same mistakes with these young Iraqi vets as we made with you Vietnam guys, and make you feel not home, not part of the society again. We have to reach out, we have to grab our hands out and say, we want you back, and fight for them. And so part of that is we as citizens have to know what we are really asking someone to do when we send them to war. What the price is that they pay and how long that they pay it, and that the collective we ask them to go. And we owe them something for that. We owe them a lot. And it saddens me that more citizens aren't here right now. And it saddens me when I go to the VA and there aren't more citizens there. I don't know the answer, but I know that I'm going to keep showing up, and I'm going to keep, it's my responsibility.
Can I respond
Yeah.
to your question, your comments? You know, one of the things that, in terms of what I've done in terms of reading, research, and writing and all this stuff, is, and I would agree with you about Vietnam, about Iraq, about Afghanistan, in terms of how people make the decisions, have never been. And they have no idea what they're sending people to do, what they're asking them to do, how they're asking them to bleed, and all the rest of it. But the thing that is so instructive about studying like the big picture is that you find societies where the people who fight are the people who decide to go, who decide to fight. I mean, they're the same, and you have the same reactions. I mean, you find basically combat trauma among people who say, okay, yeah, I vote to go, I'll go too, and they react the same way as people do today. So there's, in a sense, it's really the impact of the violence. It makes no difference what the decision process is, but the impact of the violence is the same. And that's the thing that people need to realize, is that, you know, you take away the causation, and the human reaction to the violence is the same across time and across culture.
And one of the things that concerns me, in many of the stories, piggyback on what Larry and Marcia were both saying, is the importance for all of us to grieve our losses. It's an important thing to do, and it's never too late. It's never too late. Storytelling is one of the ways in which we attend to our brokenness, and we can begin to address some of our pain. And we think that it's helpful rather than keeping it inside. When we repress our feelings and when we don't acknowledge our loss, it gets us into difficulties. And some of the kinds of things that we see problematic with people who are dealing with what we call unresolved grief. Is it creates problems with our quality of life, it creates problems with our health, it creates problems in relationships, and we're beginning to connect the dots and also beginning to see a high risk for problems in interpersonal relationships, particularly domestic violence. I do a lot of work with homicide, and one of my hypotheses is that in many cases perpetrators, particularly in terms of some of the urban youth homicide that we see, many of the perpetrators are people who are dealing with unresolved grief and loss issues. So it can reverberate and have some very negative consequences in terms of how we deal with our humanity and how we deal with others. So it's important to grieve. So telling our stories is one of the ways of attending to that, but people can also create their own rituals of grieving. So you may privately create a meaningful ritual for you, whatever that is, in terms of acknowledging those comrades, those experiences. Sometimes in its loss of innocence, loss of parts of ourselves that we need to acknowledge, but it's an important thing that we do. So think about that, and think about something that you can do either individually or collectively to help you acknowledge the experience of loss and grief, which is so important for all of us to attend to. Yes.
At our PTS group, last couple of weeks, something has come up, and basically why World War II vets didn't seem to suffer the problems that the Vietnam vets. And I brought something up. When I left the island, it took 19 days to reach San Diego. Then it took another 3 or 4 days to get back to New York. They gave me a 30-day leave. So this is like a racehorse. After it runs, they have to cool it down. Can't just stop. So this gave me a chance. On the ship, all the Marines spoke about is their combat in Iwo Jima. And that time gave me a chance to acclimate back to civilian life, even though it was wintertime and I'm coming from this equator zone. Some of the people, the Vietnam vets, one of them especially, one day he flew home, was discharged. He was screwed up for 17 years. And we're finding out that, of course now they do question you a little bit, but that's one of the reasons I think the Vietnam vets are suffering. So not so much, they all had traumatic experiences, everyone. I didn't go through too much. Mine came a little later on. But it seems like there's a time period to simmer down, to get back into civilian life and maybe think about, but to get one day from this different world of combat to civilian life, you're like left high and dry. Well, what do I do now? I'm so used to waking up and sleeping with my rifle. So that is, we're thinking about that. World War II vets did not go through the agony that Vietnam vets.
I want to tell you a little secret though, Dave. I'm there at the end of life with a lot of them. And sometimes if they have families. And a lot of times the wives covered it up for them. They would be flailing around in bed having nightmares, and the wives would call in sick, and it was a kind of a disgrace, and like, don't tell anybody, I'll just call in sick. I heard an interview, it wasn't in my personal experience, but a wife that said that he fought that war his whole life, and I covered it up for him. I hid the fact that he had PTSD. And a lot of times these things were suppressed and suppressed because that was the thing to do. And then at the end of life, which is a letting go time, things bubble up to the surface. And we see delayed onset PTSD, people that never knew they even had it. And it comes up because when the letting go comes, the stuff that you suppressed rises to the surface. I don't think anybody comes home from war unscathed.
If I can add to that, at the last show we did at Loyola Marymount, I was talking to someone in the audience, Ron and I were, and I mentioned a story that a friend of mine told me, who works with vets back on the East Coast. This is the 101st story I told you about. And Vietnam vet went to his father's funeral. And at his father's funeral, one of his father's friends, they came up to him and told him, "Did you know your dad had been with the 101st in WW2? And the guy said, "He never told me that." The kid, the son, was with the 101st in Vietnam. And for 35 years, okay, father and son never talked, okay? I had similar experience with my own father, okay? My father flew 8th Air Force, okay? He was shot down over Germany. I heard some of the fun stories, but we never talked about World War II for real, never talked about Vietnam for real. And I mean, there's just all kinds of stories like this out there. And so I think again that, there's sort of this mystique, this image about WW2 vets, that they were like, they came back and everything was fine. I think this, there's a lot of papering over the reality. And there were a lot of guys, one of my mother's brothers came back from 2 years in New Guinea, and he was never the same, and he died, 20 years, within 20 years after the war.
Yeah, well,
so I think, there's just a lot more going on with the WW2 vets
It's odd that you say
than the
that my family,
public knows.
my singing partner Dennis knows more about my war experiences than my family does.
And a lot of these guys are dying with their stories untold and unheard. And it's really not okay. I want to take one opportunity. This is our last performance of this, and the whole experience has been so extraordinary. And I've been wanting to ask Chris Sweeney, who's one of our actors and also a vet in his own right, who came in as only an actor. We didn't tell his story, and he didn't write one of the stories. He came in as an actor. And I wanted to know what the experience of participating in this process was like for you, with your own veteran experience and then portraying other vets.
It's definitely been a difficult process. I didn't want to show up tonight.
Really?
Wow. It's one of those things that you can, as Judith said, when you tell someone else's story, it becomes your own. I guess I'm very fortunate to have chosen an artistic pathway, because you speak in the theater about emotional memory, muscle memory, and it's given, being an actor, I'm a fine artist as well, has given me an opportunity to exercise a lot of those demons. So I am extremely thankful to have had this particular opportunity, and to have brought to this opportunity my own personal story, as implicitly as it was told. But I mean, Mike was the perfect template for me. I was a Marine, fought in that little war, the Persian Gulf War, but I know a lot of the things that I've struggled with is this kind of this nebulous shame because of the lopsided nature of that war. And the fact that there is a very, very small percentage of the, 500,000 troops that we shuttled over there to kick that little tyrant's ass. Everything happened so quickly and decisively. You come back and you're ashamed to talk about it. You're ashamed to call it a war, but people were dying in that war. I think what I'm going to take away from this experience is that duration has its deteriorating effect on a soldier. So the longer you're exposed to something, I think potentially the greater the post-traumatic stress is. But to take human life, that's something that needs to be addressed, and you have people saying Happy Veterans Day, you know?
Right,
It's casual,
it's
programmed,
an oxymoron.
canned response, because you don't know. I mean, when someone dies, you don't say, tell me about it, how did it happen? You say, I'm sorry for your loss. But there's no effort to actually extend a hand out and really listen, because it makes you, it frightens people. I mean, the last show that we did, I don't see Delton in the audience, but he stood up, and as a lot of vets know, you hold things in for so long because of that shame, that once your mouth opens, it's hard to shut it. Things start to come out, and stories, and then the next thing you know, you've told a story in a way that's frightening to the people around you, and you don't. And the idea of killing is it's frightening and mysterious to people. As Deshaun said in telling Delton's story, some people think it's cool. Like I said, vets have a tendency to ramble, but I had a fellow actor that I met at an audition, and he started crying. He was a friendly fellow, and he started asking me things, and my age came up, and I said that I'd been in the military, and then he starts asking questions. Did you kill him? Were you in combat? And I felt like I even felt like it was an inappropriate question, but he's doing exactly what so many vets need, is for people to drop that wall, that barrier, and ask difficult questions. Because at the core of a veteran who has taken life, they need to confess. I mean, a lot of people would shame me for feeling guilty. They say, you did your job. You went over there, you did what you had to do. But there is no job title of killer. It just really isn't, and I think as a society, we need to reshape our thinking and understand that has to be stricken from our vocabulary.
We don't accept dying either, killing or dying.
We are all.
It's not on our mental landscape at all.
But it is endemic to our culture.
Yeah.
And the actor's response when he found out, rather than, I don't know what his appropriate response was, he goes, that is killer, that is wicked. Thinking, using some hip term to describe what it was to take human life. He didn't even think about it. It was
Alienated
cool.
you
It was a
more.
cool idea that I had done something that very few people in my generation have done. So, that being said, I'll go back to one thing and then I'll shut up. The arts, I work with a veterans nonprofit called the United States Veterans Artists Alliance, which is here in Culver City. And they basically advocate the sooner, the better, that veterans, combat veterans, veterans of any kind, when they come back, they immerse themselves, whether they think of themselves as artistic. We're all creative beings, and it really helps a lot of guys out. And I happened chanced upon it because I was doing a play at that space, and the director, Keith Jeffries, found out I was a vet. He gave space for free, no cost, free of charge, and since then, Keith Jeffries has been basically my sponsor. I mean, he's there, and those are the kind of people, Mike Baldridge doing Sepulveda, the VA.
It's doing service too.
Service,
It
and that's the
has-
only way to really heal those wounds.
Exactly.
It really is, telling stories and helping.
Because when you're doing service, you drop your own story. You get out of your own story, and it's not about you anymore, and it can save you. It saved me. It saved Mike. It saved Thad Ballou. And it can save some of our young vets now, too. Thank you, Chris.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you very much for also providing this. About 30 years ago, I had two teachers. One was a history teacher, one was a psychology teacher. Pretty remarkable guys, very, very bright, very entertaining.
Like the two of us.
Sort of like that. And both gave insights, I think, that relate exactly to what we're talking about tonight in a different plane. The one history teacher, who often said things that were very subtle and dropped little bombs that would fester on your lap until the light went off, made a comment in class. He said, "It's not about ideology when you're in a foxhole." You said that. And I know that was probably, less than 10 years after you came back, but it was so poignant because you have a bunch of 18-year-old kids in a room that are just idealistic about whatever's being sold at the time, whatever the concept is. And I think when we talk about the difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and Gulf Crisis versus World War I or World War II is in some cases it's however it's being packaged at the time. I'm sure in Roman times, obviously, the soldiers weren't deciding what wars they were going to go to fight either. It was still the Senate deciding who's going where for what purpose. So you still have that breakdown of the system in terms of who's calling the shots and who's doing the fighting, who's shedding blood. But I think that's where we're going to continue to have a difficulty of melding how we address these situations, how we receive our soldiers again, because we can't reconcile killing and melding back in. It doesn't work that easily. You can't just say, okay, that was one set of rules and now this is another set of rules. We can't reconcile ideology and, you know what, it's me or him and I'm in a hole and I'm hiding under my buddy who I just went to get a cup of coffee and I came back and everybody in that hole is dead, and I'm hiding under him because I'm so afraid that I'm going to be the next guy that's dead. And I stayed there for 2 hours with the dead guy on top of me because I was afraid to God that they were going to kill me too.
And also in the way we train our vets, we train them to don't think, don't feel, just react. I'm going to give this order, you do that. That's not a person, that's a target. You're not killing somebody, you're taking them out. And so they take you away from your feelings, from your heart, from your soul, and put you into this reactive mode and not a responding mode. And they don't undo it before they send you home. So you come back, and if you ever want to get back into your feelings and into your own self again, you have to say to yourself, my God, I fell for a bluff. It wasn't a target. It was a real guy I killed. I actually killed somebody. It wasn't a taking out. I killed. I fell for a bluff. I'm pissed.
And that's why I think it's kind of hard if you get fully into this, like you're somehow going to seek a resolution, because it doesn't work that way. You don't go, oh, okay, now I get it. I worked it all out. It was like, wait a minute, there were no weapons of mass destruction. Or, wait a minute, what I was told is why we were going over there is not really why I went over there. And, but also, from a psychological perspective, Dr. Barrett, when you're looking at Achilles, when you're looking at everything that happened in the antiquities in Rome, what have you, they worshiped their warriors, right? I mean, you came back, you were a hero, right? You kicked ass and, you were respected because of that role. We've become so PC in everything that we do that that's not cool anymore, right? I mean, obviously, you don't want to get to the point where it's Vietnam where you're going, you're a baby killer, because I had guys that I knew and worked with that when they came back from Nam, people were screaming that to them, when they were walking down the street. So there's all kinds of issues that hopefully, yes, we will not repeat. But at the same time, we can't reconcile so that on Memorial Day you go, you kicked ass, hey, way to go, buddy, that must have been really cool. Because that's ridiculous. But at the same time, I think in the olden days, they kind of did some of that, right? I mean, it was basically, you were the gladiator.
Yeah, if I can, one of the things that is important to keep in mind about the veteran, the soldier, the combatant, okay, is that it's about death, okay? I mean, let's face it, no one gets out of life alive, okay? Sigmund Freud had a favorite saying, that I owe death a life, okay? And the thing is, this is a reality. We don't talk about it very much, Okay, people don't think about it very much, but it is a reality. The thing is that when you're a soldier in the front, I mean, when you're in combat situations, this is something that never leaves you. There's no escape. You're trapped. And you think about death all the time. And you think, and death comes in 1,000 different ways. I mean, just when you think you've seen all the possible ways someone can die, you get surprised. Okay? And the thing is, this becomes a very wearing process on the human psyche. It just sort of tears you down. Okay? And so when you finally do come out of it, well, you're a changed person. You're a changed person. And this is one of the things that lies at the heart of the experience of war. And again, it's something that cuts across time and it cuts across culture.
We're getting the wrap it up thing.
One of the heavy combat veterans in our group said he has a friend of his who was a Purple. Do you know how many Purple Heart recipients are alive today? 93.
From your work?
Not Purple Heart, I'm sorry. Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
He said he has a hero in his combat group. Would we mind if they bring him in? If he brings him into the group? Of course, we said no. Bring him. And all of a sudden, this disheveled monstrous of a man, long, dirty, smelly, came in. And he said, I'd like to introduce you to my combat buddy. So this fellow, he spoke pretty good, but he did bring out that he had tried rehab 6 times. So since Vietnam, he had a picture of President Johnson putting the Congressional Medal of Honor on him, a handsome John Wayne, that's what he looked like. I mean, he was epitome of what a man should be. And so he told a story and he passed out a paper. He was wounded 3 times, but he saved 3 lives. He literally dragged 2 at one time, wounded people back, saved their lives, and went again and knocked out a machine gun nest, and he had a death wish. Anyway, I said to him, I wanted to speak to him. I said, well, you got the Congressional Honor. How have you used it? Well, it's kept me out of jail. So I was devastated. And so much compassion for this man that he could not straighten out. This is since Vietnam War.
We can't.
He's not the only one. I know that.
In terms of unpacking this, there's just so much, and we could certainly spend a lot more time. But the other piece here that I would certainly encourage you to think about is to think about how we raise boys in our society, and I think that's a part of this challenge for many of us, and that is, as boys, we're raised to stuff our feelings. Men don't cry. Men don't show feelings. Men don't show fear. We don't show hurt. And we learn to embrace that masculinity or those notions, and that gets us into a lot of trouble. Because we've been talking about humanity and the violation of what war does to our sense of self. But as men, we have got to face our feelings. We've got to talk about the fear, we've got to talk about the shame, we've got to talk about the guilt, and own up to this. So storytelling is one of the ways that we unpack that. But certainly talk to one another, breathe, and begin to write your own stories, write your own narrative. That's an important thing.
I'd just like to do a very special thank you for these 3 people who have been with us in the project from its inception. All of them have been involved. All 4 of the people out here have been involved in forming and shaping the project. And we want to give them a special thank you for being here at the very